All right, I think that was successful. Not sure what happened there. So our next speaker is Darlene Young. Darlene, we're so happy to have you with us here today. I'm going to start off by providing your bio to everybody, and then I'll start your screen share. So Darlene is here from the Old Stonehouse Museum in Brownington, Vermont. She has worked in the museum field, newspaper publishing, and higher education. Darlene's position at the Old Stone House Museum includes managing the archival collection as well as the material culture collection. She is the author of A Local Town History and many articles relating to the history of rural northeastern Vermont, where she lives. All right, so let me see if I can queue up your slides. All right, so Darlene, I think we're ready when you are.
All right, great. Thanks, Erica. Um, yeah, so I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience in doing large scale inventory without a lot of resources. So next slide, please, Erica. And thank you, Erica, for being my tech assistant. All right. Before I get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Old Stone House. Um, just a quick introduction. We're listed on the National Register. The centerpiece of the museum is the four-story granite building that you see in the photograph. That was completed in 1836 as a school dormitory. Um, this year, we're celebrating our 100th anniversary of functioning as a museum. So we opened in 1925. We're located on a dirt road in a pretty remote part of the Northeast Kingdom. It's a place that is known for its beauty, its natural beauty, its sense of community, and its economic challenges. We get about 10,000 visitors a year, and we're open from May to October. Next, next slide, please. Thank you. So now a little about our collection. It's a broad collection. Um, we interpret the life of Alexander Twilight, who's the first credited with being the first African American college graduate in the country, as well as the principal of the first secondary school in Orleans County. Twilight was instrumental in the construction of that building in the background of this photograph. But so in addition to interpreting the life of Alexander Twilight, we also interpret the history of Orleans County and the broader region. We estimate our collection has about 75,000 objects. That is just an estimate. It includes a research library, archival material, furniture, farming and household tools and equipment, boats, horse-drawn vehicles, works of fine art, folk art, toys, games. You get the idea. It's broad. The museum is comprised of 8 buildings and about 65 acres of land. 4 of the buildings are open to the public with exhibits. 5 house storage of our collections. Some buildings have both storage and exhibits. And next slide, please. I have titled my presentation Inventorying a Previously Unmanaged Collection. It's kind of a riff on Angela Kipp's book, Managing Previously Unmanaged Collections. So here's the story. During the first 50 years of operation, the museum had no paid staff and no real systematic approach to managing its collection. During the last 50 years, the museum has seen periods of having paid staff, typically part-time, working to manage the collection. But there have also been periods in which the museum had no staff dedicated exclusively for collections work. Over the years, volunteers have done a huge amount of work in the collection, but we're playing catch up, needless to say. And next slide, please. Thanks. I was hired as the museum's registrar in late 2022, after a period of about 5 years in which the museum had no designated collection staff. I started by having conversations with the director, colleagues, some of my predecessors, to sort of start to get a handle on where we were. It became clear to me that the museum had numerous old loans, many objects without provenance, and many uncatalogued objects. I also suspected there was a real need for deaccessioning. As someone who is relatively new to the collection, I needed a way to get a handle on that, on understanding the collection. Comprehensive inventories had been done in 1956 and again in the 1990s, none more recently. So clearly there was a need for an inventory. Some smaller inventories had been conducted. For instance, the textiles had been inventoried in the 80s. Some storage rooms had been inventoried in the early 2000s. Next slide, please. So it was clear that I needed to do an inventory. Part-time. I couldn't do it by myself. The museum had a volunteer who was very eager to work in collections. So in January 2024, I decided to start with a trial run. And we started with an inventory of a framed object storage room located in one of the buildings that was heated year-round. I did some training with the volunteer on handling techniques, provided him with some pointers on technology, as my plan was to use Google Sheets, and I outlined the types of information I was looking for. As he and I worked together, we refined the process, kind of by trial and error. For the most part, especially early on, the volunteer was the one who was collecting the information, and I was reviewing it for accuracy, consistency. Not that I was retracing his steps, but I was just kind of keeping tabs on terminology, that kind of thing. As we moved into the spring of 2024, and the weather allowed us to begin working in the Stone House, our main exhibit building, that is not heated year-round, I defined the project ahead. 5 of the storage rooms in the Stone House had been relatively recently inventoried by volunteers, but the exhibit areas had not been inventoried since the 90s. Those became our priority, all 22 rooms of them. Next slide, please. The project would never have been possible without the help of volunteers. Over the course of 2 years, our project has involved about 15 volunteers, some for a single day, others for 2 or 3 days, and one, the one that I started with, for a day a week for the whole length of the project. He loves inventory and he's a pro. Last fall, the CCCA helped us with our inventory during their day of service. I found when recruiting volunteers for the project, it was helpful to think about their skills, their aptitudes, and the experience that they were going to bring to the project. Generally speaking, teams of 2 worked well. I could usually put together teams with complementary skills. For instance, teaming up somebody who was comfortable with spreadsheets with someone knowledgeable about tools, for instance, or furniture or toys, whatever our focus was that day. As we worked, some preferences of the volunteers became apparent. Some preferred to work as a team, others independently. Supervision was important. Often I was working in the next room, readily available to answer questions, or when I had multiple teams of volunteers scattered throughout the building, I was regularly checking in with each team. And next slide, please. I apologize for this deadly slide. It's a spreadsheet, but just wanted to show you, give you an example of the spreadsheet we used. Types of data we were collecting, obviously object name, any numbers associated with objects, a brief description, dimensions, overall condition, location, any other information that might be on a label or a tag, particularly donor information, as found in collections was on our radar as a big need. And the next slide, please. How we're using the data. This slide shows some of the ways I've used the information we've collected over the last 2 years. You can see I've made notes, as Eileen was talking about. I've used highlighting. Yellow indicates I've reviewed the object for donor information to see if it should be included in our Found in Collections project. And I've also used the spreadsheet to update location information in our database. So when I complete the update, I highlight the line in red. I have found it's easy to lose my place. So the highlighting helps keep me on track. I've used the information during the accessioning, cataloging, deaccessioning processes. I typically go back to the object before finalizing a recommendation or a record, but the inventory gives me a solid place to start. And next slide, please. So looking back, some reflections. Inventorying a large collection without a lot of resources is certainly possible. In our case, volunteers made it doable. We celebrated each milestone. It took us a little over a year to complete our inventory of the exhibit areas in the stone house, but we cheered every time we finished a room. The end result isn't perfect, but our inventory has already proved enormously helpful. It can feel daunting and overwhelming. My advice is just push through, keep going. It's going to be worth it. And we have moved on to inventorying other buildings. And just last week, we completed an inventory of one of our barns. And last slide. So that's our story. Thanks for listening, and thank you, Erica, for helping me with the technology, and I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Darlene. It's wonderful to hear what you've been working on for the Old Stonehouse Museum. Next, we're going to switch gears and talk about an archival collection. Next up, we have Shearbach and Sally Blanchard O'Brien from the University of Vermont. So I'm going to read their bios and then turn things over to them. So Shearbach is a Congressional Papers archivist at the University of Vermont Libraries. Shear received his MLIS from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2023, where he worked at the Southern Oral History Program. Outside of the Congressional Papers world, Shear has a research interest in the history of psychiatric institutionalization. Sally Blanchard O'Brien works as a Congressional Papers archivist at the University of Vermont Libraries as well. Sally has over a decade of experience with government records, holding a previous role at the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, and she serves on the Library Commission for the City of Burlington, Vermont. She received an MLIS from San Jose State University in 2012 and became a certified archivist in 2020. So over to you, Sally and Shear.
All right, let me get the slides going here. And okay, can everyone see that? Great. Well, thank you, Erica. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm really happy to be with you this afternoon. I'm Sally Blanchard O'Brien. I'm here with my colleague, Shearbach. And if you've been doing your math, you maybe figured out that our third project colleague is actually Erica Donis, our leader for today and the president of the CCCA. We're fortunate enough to be able to work with her. We are going to be talking about our process for inventorying different formats within our archival collection. But first, I want to provide a little bit of background about our project at large. So Senator Leahy served in office for 48 years, making him the longest serving US Senator in Vermont and the third longest serving senator in US history. So following his retirement in 2023, he donated his papers to the Silver Special Collections Library at the University of Vermont. His collection contains nearly 3,000 linear feet of paper records and multimedia content, which we will be getting into later, and about 20 terabytes of digital records. Throughout his career, the senator had an interest in preserving his papers for both his own legacy and for the historical record. So he supported records management guidance in his office, and he hired a staff archivist starting in the mid-1990s. And in 2022, he was instrumental in developing the Senate's Preservation Partnership Grant Program. And this program is a bipartisan initiative that set aside $10 million for the preservation of senatorial papers, and it's managed by the US Senate Historical Office. So 5 institutions around the country received funding, including us here at UVM. We received a 5-year, $2.5 million grant to hire the 3 of us archivists to pay for folders, boxes, other preservation supplies, to set up infrastructure for the digital portions of the collection, and much more. The collection covers tons of topics, including correspondence, speeches, briefings, schedules, legislative research, and more. It's important to note that the Leahy papers and the personal papers of other members of Congress are not made up of records that are created by one person. The Leahy papers are truly the work product of the nearly 1,300 staffers that worked in each of the senator's 3 offices. He had 1 in DC and 2 in Vermont. And that was over the course of 48 years that he spent in office. So this means that lots of different people created and managed the records, and the record keeping practices and styles could change over time. So this is something to keep in mind when we've been doing our inventorying, because the records might not always look consistent. So we are Congressional Papers archivists, and in the archival world, we look at things in the aggregate. So this is for several reasons. Firstly, the volume of records that is just such that we basically can't afford the time and resources to inventory and organize things at the individual item level. There are also important relationships between records within a folder, within a box, and within the collection that make it necessary to preserve those holistic collections. So the records speak to each other, and we want to describe things in a way that makes those relationships and those functions apparent. And looking at things in the aggregate also helps us maintain, where possible, original order. And that's the order that the creator of the records established. The way that a creator organized and used their records shows important context about them, and managing things in the aggregate helps maintain that order and context. So as we go about inventorying within our project, we are thinking about the collective, the groups of records about related topics, the groups of records created by the same individual, We're collecting a lot of information about the records, but we're doing it at the folder level, capturing these related chunks of content and not individual items. And with all of that being said, I will now pass to Sheer, who will talk more in depth about the inventory process for our paper records.
Thanks, Sally. So the largest part of the Leahy Papers collection is the literal papers. We had somewhere around 2,500 records cartons when we started the project. Those are the size of the photos that you see there. And about 80% of those were primarily or exclusively full of paper records. And we need to inventory these records in order to gain intellectual and physical control of them so that we can make them available to researchers. It's helpful to start any inventory project with an idea in mind of where you're headed. So for us, the ultimate goal is the finding aid. Sally, if you want to move to the next slide.
Sorry, it's stuck.
I'll keep talking then. So the finding aid is the key to the collection. It's the resource that researchers will use to find which of the 2,500 boxes they want to review in person. There are a few key pieces of information that we capture on each folder: titles, dates, creators, and language. And everything else that we capture during the inventorying process is in service of creating this finding aid. So now that we know where we're headed, we can start at where we began. We began this project not with a blank slate, but with a complicated landscape of overlapping legacy work. And now you can see this is what our finding aid looks like, what I was talking about just a moment ago. We can move to the next slide. So as Sally mentioned, Senator Leahy had an archivist on staff starting in 1995, and the office contracted with an archival consulting firm in 2009 to produce a provisional series arrangement and a database for creating inventories. And that database was then supplemented with inventories that were created in Microsoft Word by staff archivists. Now, most, but not all of the boxes that we received were inventoried under both systems, and most of the time, those two inventories matched. Sometimes they didn't, and we found that when this was the case, the Word doc inventories were the ones that matched the actual contents of the box. So when working with this mix of legacy inventories and when working with legacy inventories in general, format matters a lot. Word documents and PDFs are way less useful than spreadsheets, and databases are only really useful if you can work within them or export them into a different format. So it may not be worth your time trying to massage previous inventories into better shape if you know that you're going to have to physically review the content anyways. And for us, we knew that we would have to inventory boxes with our own system so that we could confirm accuracy and capture information that wasn't recorded in these previous inventories, things like the presence of sensitive information. And so with that in mind, instead of trying to export these inventories into Excel and use them as a base for our own process, we decided to treat them as a way to preview boxes, which then cuts down on the number of times that we need to physically pull and open a box before we actually sit down and inventory it. We exported the database inventories into a PDF format that lists all the boxes in a single file. And we also collated the Word document inventories into a similar single PDF. And this allows us to look up box IDs and use keyword searches on these two PDFs as part of our appraisal and series assignment work that happens before we jump into the actual inventorying. So as far as the actual inventorying process goes, the key word here is iteration. In a large collection like ours, the only way to gather enough information to develop your process is actually just to start the process without that information. And so we began inventorying boxes just a few days into starting this project. Practically the only thing that has stayed the same in the past 2 years is our choice of a platform. We decided to use Excel for the web to create our inventories for a few different reasons. Spreadsheets are more flexible and able to be manipulated and edited than working directly within our collection management system. They also enable us to work collaboratively in ways that we couldn't achieve with a relational database like Microsoft Access. And then we work on a Microsoft campus, which is really the only reason that we're using Excel and not Google Sheets. So though we've stayed with Excel, the structure of the spreadsheets themselves have changed really dramatically over time. Our first survey of the records was mainly aimed at gathering enough information about the content to sort boxes into a hierarchical series structure. But it also helped us learn what we needed and didn't need to capture. So our first inventory does have a couple of columns that we no longer use, like ones for tracking anticipated research value at the folder level or tracking topics covered in each folder. That version is also missing many columns that we added later on, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But one of the most dramatic transformations has been with the issues column. So this started out as an unstructured column where we wrote any and all notes about the folder and its contents that we thought might come into play later. So that could have been anything from there's a CD in the back of this book to the senator's social security number is on this email to this is a legal sized paper, but it's in a letter sized folder. And often there were several things of note that we put all in the same issue column in the same cell. So once we had a solid survey of our collection, around 60 boxes, around 3% of the total collection, I ported our inventory sheet into a free open source data cleanup tool called OpenRefine. And I started breaking that issue column down into individual entries, trying to find patterns and grouping together notes that had slightly different wording or formatting, but were saying the same thing. And that's what you see in this middle picture here. So what we ended up with is a controlled vocabulary of 15 different issue flags that we record in our inventory and then accompany with physical paper flags in the folder. And these flags are action oriented. So instead of describing all of the reasons why a folder might need to be replaced, we just use the refolder tag for all of those. And the controlled vocabulary is a really important part of our process because it enables the three of us to record consistent information and then pass it on to interns who complete specific tasks based on the flags they see. So when an intern sees the refolder tag, they know exactly what they have to do with the folder instead of having to determine the action based on our descriptive notes. Sally will talk more later about how we designed our multimedia inventory to work for students as well. The other big change that we made to the inventory sheet was aligning it with our final goal of the finding aid. UVM uses archive space to write and display our finding aids, so we created a crosswalk to map our inventory fields to the archive space fields. We adjusted as necessary, creating new columns for fields that we didn't initially track or fields that would stay the same for each row. And we also developed a standards and style guide to ensure that everything would be imported correctly. This was a huge project that involved many hours of thinking through every possible exception to date formatting, creating local standards for creator names, and a lot of trial and error with Archive Space's import functions. But it was really necessary for us to do this work as soon as we had our bearings on the collection, and then also to make peace with the fact that we would have to iterate and adjust in the future as we learn more. So there are some simple things we learned throughout this process that you can do to prepare your data for the eventuality of midstream adjustments. All of this can be summed up with the instruction to use structured data as much as possible. Columns should only record one piece of information, so don't combine things like title and date like we did at first. And ideally, output should be restricted to either a controlled vocabulary or a strict format. If you're working in Excel, you'll also want to pay extra attention to identifiers and dates, making sure that you commit to formats that will work with Excel's somewhat finicky sorting and filtering functions. It might help to think of your spreadsheets as a test, which you want to make as easy to grade as possible. So controlled vocabularies are like multiple choice questions. They're the easiest to grade and the best to use. Next, there's short answer questions where the answer is always going to be a single word or a number in a strict format. And then finally, the hardest to grade are the essay questions. These are the notes columns. You will probably want a notes column where you can dump unstructured information, but it's really helpful to commit to using a unique delimiter in case you need to parse that information out later. And a delimiter is a special character that you will use to separate different pieces of information within the same cell. So it's really important that you only ever use that character for that purpose. And we use semicolons as our delimiters. So for example, we have a notes column that we use to add extra context to other columns that are structured and to dump any information that doesn't fit elsewhere. So the bottom of this slide shows an example from our inventory that has three separate ideas that are joined into the same cell with semicolons. And the first part of this note gives additional info to the issue column, where we used the flag exhibit value as one of our controlled vocabulary options. So if in the future we wanted to grab all of the details about folders that had exhibit value worthy documents in them and move those into another column, it will be possible because we can reliably split this note into three different strings and then only move the relevant one over. This kind of data cleanup is pretty easily done with OpenRefine, which I really highly recommend if you're going to be using spreadsheets for inventorying. So finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about some tips and tricks for working collaboratively. Like I said, we use Excel for the web, which enables us to work on the same spreadsheet in real time. And to do that, we make heavy use of a feature called sheet views. And sheet views are a way to save a certain view of a spreadsheet that you can work within and manipulate without affecting anyone else's view if they have the document open at the same time. So I could be in one sheet view filtering the inventory to only look at a certain series and then sorting all of the folders by date, while Sally could be in another sheet view inventorying a new box and hiding all of the columns that we don't use during the initial inventory. Google Sheets also has a similar function called filter view. I really recommend making use of these features anytime you're working collaboratively. So that is a quick introduction into how we make our paper records inventorying work. We also use spreadsheets to inventory the multimedia portion of our collection, but the process looks really different when you're thinking about item level inventorying on objects where you can't actually access the content during inventory. And so I'll pass it off to Sally next to talk about how we approach those challenges.
So first, it's important to explain what we mean by multimedia because that term can mean different things to different people. So the way we are using it, it's referring to any items of physical media that are not paper and that require special technology or playback equipment to view. So this could be stuff like audiovisual material like CDs, DVDs, VHS, beta tapes, audio cassettes, reel-to-reel. It could also be carriers for digital files, so floppy disks, hard drives, flash drives. It could also be something like microfilm. And do we have all of these formats in the collection? Yes, we do, and still more. Because the senator was in office for almost 50 years, we really have a time capsule of how office technology has changed over the course of the last few decades. There are, of course, challenges that are unique to multimedia formats. Technology is always changing, so formats are becoming obsolete, makes them harder to use and to play back. As new technology emerges, older formats aren't supported, and the equipment used for playback gets harder to find and more expensive to maintain. And additionally, these types of formats aren't meant for longevity. So as time goes on, tapes and discs degrade, meaning that the information can be lost. So Sheer mentioned item level, and do you remember back to our introduction when I explained that archivists deal with things in the aggregate? Well, I'm about to defy that for just a moment. So while that's the approach that we took for inventorying our paper records, as Sheer just described, we did make the decision to inventory our multimedia at the item level. This is because that there are unique characteristics particular to each item. So while the content, of course, is very important, we also need to capture specific information about the format of the item to know what equipment or software that we might need to be able to play it. But in a way, multimedia items are like boxes. So each CD or flash drive, etc., it is a single item, but like a box, it's a container for multiple records inside of it. So for that reason, I will say that we are not actually flouting the archival rules of inventorying in the aggregate. So as we set up our inventory process, we set up a template in Excel spreadsheet, of course, anticipating what information that we might need to use for the future that were unique to our goals for the project. So you can see all the elements listed here. Some we decided were required that we absolutely needed to capture, and some we decided were optional. So I'm going to briefly go through each of these. We first assigned each item a unique ID, a number specific to that item so that we could use to track it. The unique ID was the first thing that we entered into the inventory, and it was written on a piece of paper that was then attached to the item so that it could be found in the box later. Another thing that we used to track the item for retrieval was a description of the physical item or its case to help us identify it in the box when we needed to pull it. So this was a brief description, as simple as clear plastic case or white cardstock case. We captured any information from the labels on the media or the cases that the media was housed in. So sometimes this was very informative, like the example shown here that states that the senator was appearing on these specific news programs with these specific senators to talk about these specific topics on this specific date. That's incredibly helpful. But sometimes the labels are less helpful, like this one that just vaguely says Leahy letters. And sometimes there were no labels at all. So label information and dates were fields in our inventory that we always filled out because any information is important. It would at least give us some idea of what kinds of records or recordings might be on the item and the years that were covered. If there was no label, we would enter unlabeled. So we knew that it was indeed an unlabeled item and not that the information was just missing from the inventory. And we did the same with dates. So if there was no date provided, it was entered as undated. So it was clear that the information was indeed missing and just not that it just didn't get written down while we were doing the inventory. Another piece of information that we always captured was the media type. So this is where we would note the item's format, if it was a CD or floppy disk or flash drive. This was also crucial information because it would tell us what we would need for, or what kind of software, what kind of player, to be able to access it, play it back, and get to the content recorded on it. In our inventory, we devised a controlled list of types to select from. And of course, as the inventory progressed, we found formats that we hadn't thought of or even heard of, including for myself anyway, things like digital audio tape, DV cam, and U-matic. So you can see our final list on this slide. We had other elements in our inventory that we captured when known or provided, but we didn't require them. So we captured the runtime if it was an audiovisual recording and the length of the recording was provided. So this helps researchers know how long a video or an audio recording might last so they can plan their research. But we also captured the storage capacity of the media, especially helpful if the running time was not provided. So for example, a CDR disk has a capacity of 4.7 gigabytes of storage, and certain types of audio cassettes and VHS tapes have capacity to record up to 120 minutes of content. It was also helpful to capture the brand or the model of the item if known. So this could help us determine what the storage capacity of the item might be by doing a little bit of research. So for example, if a VHS tape might not have the recording's length, and it might not even say what the storage capacity is, but if we see that the tape is a Fuji type T120 brand, for example, and we look that up, then we find that it has a capacity of recording 120 minutes. And that capacity is really helpful for us to know because we then know how long it's possible for a recording to be, even if it turns out not to be that long. And finally, we did have, as you can imagine, an open field for notes to capture anything that didn't fit inside another category and to just capture anything that was noteworthy. So for example, some items came with letters tucked inside, and so this is a place where we would note that, or anything kind of unusual. And we did have a field to capture who inventoried the item, and then another field to capture the date it was inventoried in case questions came up later. There was one additional piece of information that we captured at the time of the inventory that wasn't directly connected to the item itself. Based on the information gleaned from the label, we assigned the item a content type category. So again, this was a drop-down list of a controlled vocabulary to keep things consistent, and you can see the types listed here. The reason for determining this at the time of inventory was to have a preliminary assessment of where the content might fit into our arrangement scheme. So having that preliminary assessment allowed us to do some analysis and refinement of the inventory to plan for next steps, what to do after the inventory was complete. So what are those next steps? How can the data from the inventory help us with other projects going forward? As Sheer said earlier, it's good to start an inventory of the project an inventory project with an idea in mind of where you're headed. So the next step for us is appraisal. We're working on that currently. We're figuring out what we're going to retain, what we're going to deaccession, what portion of the material that we do retain is worth the cost of actually reformatting into another format, into a digital format. So as you might imagine, the label information as well as the content type help us determine this. So by knowing what the material is, we can anticipate the potential researcher interest in it, which makes retaining and reformatting more important. But the media type is also really important for our appraisal. If the format is something known to be unstable or obsolete, like magnetic tape found in audio or video cassettes, or the larger 5 to 8 inch actually floppy disks, that also raises the importance of reformatting to a digital medium because we want to avoid the loss of that information. And after we appraise and make prioritized decisions, we will move then to reformatting. So some of this will be done in-house, and again, this is the importance of the format category, and some will be done by sending to vendors. The inventory data itself will be useful in creating lists or manifests for the vendor of the media items being shipped to them. In planning for storage of the digital files once returned, the files will be stored in our digital repository. The runtime and the storage capacity inventory elements are helpful in estimating the amount of storage that we will need. And once the items have been weeded and deaccessioned, the remainder of the items will be sorted where possible into where they fit within our arrangement scheme. So based on refinement of the initial content type category that we captured at the time of our inventory, we will determine where the items fit into the arrangement and describe them in connection with the paper materials that they're related to. So as you've seen, this is a lot of iterative work, and we could not do this without we couldn't do this kind of intensive item level inventory without the help of additional labor. So we're very fortunate that the grant includes a generous amount of funding for multiple project archivists, as well as for student internships to support our work. So this is really a win-win situation for us. We get the help that we need to complete our complex project, but students also get hands-on work experience in the archival field. So once we figured out what data points that we wanted to capture in our multimedia inventory, and then we tested out the inventorying process ourselves, we trained our interns on the process. We helped them to identify formats that they had never interacted with before. We gave them tips on how to read difficult handwriting, which always came up on the labels. And we helped them to understand what types of content would fall under which categories. And they grew more confident in all of these areas as they went on. And over the course of multiple semesters, we had 7 interns working to inventory almost 7,000 multimedia items, all while working on various other projects for us as well. So thinking back to Eileen saying that it's important to have an inventory that's easy to pick up, this is an example of that. We are so grateful to our interns, and we could not have done it without their invaluable work. Currently, we are using the inventory or the label information and the content type category to help us identify which items are unknowns or unlabeled. We have another intern this semester helping to view those items, and at least the ones that we have the equipment in-house to be able to view the material. And that will help us identify what the content is. And then we will iteratively go back to appraising those items as we know more about them. In the future, after we've decided what items we will digitize, we will likely have interns help us digitize the formats that we have the equipment to do in-house. And they will likely also help us create packing lists for the formats that we have to send to ship materials to a vendor for digitization. And I just want to reiterate how crucial the help of interns has been for us. We estimate that intern labor will contribute over 5,000 hours of work on the project, and that time is crucial to successfully completing the work over the course of our 5-year timeline. And like Eileen said in the beginning, teamwork makes the dream work. I love that phrase. But personally, it's really been rewarding for us to build relationships with students and to watch them learn and grow as well.
Great. So as we approach the halfway point of this grant project, we've learned a lot about what it takes to successfully inventory a complex, large-scale archival collection. And I'll wrap up our presentation today by just doing a quick review of some of the concepts that we talked about. So first up, inventorying in the aggregate. As archivists, we inventory material at an aggregate level rather than individual, which allows us to move through high volumes of material and preserve relationships between items. Next up, collaboration. Large-scale inventorying projects will almost always involve more than one person, and so we had to build our workflows with collaboration in mind, especially when thinking about involving student workers. And next, iteration. Both our paper-based and multimedia inventorying workflows have changed a lot since we first started, so we've intentionally built processes that can accommodate those inevitable midstream changes. And finally, clean data. This is what allows us to do collaboration and iteration. We have committed to creating inventories that are made primarily out of structured data that can be consistently produced, easily understood by everyone who works on the project, and manipulated into different forms if needed. So I'll leave you with just one final plea to use structured data as much as possible in your inventorying projects. You will thank us later. And that's all we've got for you.
Well, thank you so much, Sally and Sheer. It's wonderful to hear from you about our project. And so our final speaker this afternoon is Angela Stanford. So I'm going to give you Angela's bio and then turn things over to her. So Angela has 25 years of expertise in collections documentation, care, inventory, deaccessioning, and policy writing. She is the owner of Advanced Museum Services and acts as the Assistant Museum Director and Registrar at the Madison County Historical Complex, both in Iowa. For more than 17 years, she served as a registrar at the Museum of Danish America in Elkhorn, Iowa, leading them to first-time accreditation through the American Alliance of Museums and being one of the project leaders for a major building expansion. She has conducted numerous trainings in the area of collections registration and care, has participated on many boards, serves as a grant reviewer for state and federal programs, provides consultations through the Field Services Program for the State Historical Society of Iowa, and has been a peer reviewer for the American Alliance of Museums MAP and accreditation programs. Throughout her career, inventory has been a major recurring project with many collections from basic to intensive, and is a central service that she provides as a contractor.
All right, thank you, Erica. I'll get my screen shared here. All right, hopefully everyone can see that. There we go. All right. Yeah, so just to kind of jump right in, I know we're a little close on time here, so I'll kind of try to keep things moving along as well as I can here. Everyone else, just to give you a brief background on the facility that the place that we're talking about right now. The Museum of Danish America, you'll also hear me call it MODA because that's a much shorter, easier acronym to use. Was founded in 1983. It's located in Elkhorn, Iowa, which is a tiny little town. It's about 800 people, if that. But it's an area that was heavily settled by Danish immigrants a century or so ago, and so it became the home of this national museum. We sat on 35 acres, and the acreages are largely planted with native prairies. We had 4 facilities: the main museum building, which you see here, as well as a genealogy center, which was located just a few blocks away uptown. We had a 1908 Victorian home, and then a small turn-of-the-century homesteaders cabin that had been moved in from North Dakota. So our collecting began in 1985, so a fairly young museum by comparison to a lot of others. By the time I was there, we had roughly about 25,000 objects and photographs, plus we had an archive which included library materials, books and yearbooks and things like that. And then, as Erica read, I was part of an expansion project. So just on the photograph here, just to the left side, you'll see some plantings with some signage. That actually is the roof of our curatorial center addition, which we added in 2013. We had previously had 2 vaults for collections, and with this addition, we ended up with 5. So it was a wonderful project to be part of. We were really excited to be able to expand. We had offsite storage, so we were able to consolidate all of that back on site. So by the time I left, we had no offsite storage anymore. Everything was on site and wonderful. So and we were successful with accreditation in 2016. I was the only full-time collection staff member. I was the full-time registrar, and then we also were very grateful to have a wonderful core of interns that rotated through on a pretty regular basis. So kind of a quick snapshot of MODA, but kind of set the stage then for our project. So I started there in 2004. It was my first, I had some internships and temporary positions, but I'd never been a full-time staff member with a permanent position. So it was my first time managing a collection. And so kind of putting all those methods into actual practice, all those ideals into reality. So I needed to learn what we had. I didn't know the collection. I do not have a Danish background myself, so I didn't even have that personal attachment built, kind of coming into the position. And one of the things that I was discovering pretty quickly was that a lot of times visitors, as most of us do, we have folks that stop in to say, hey, my grandma's whatever is here. We'd love to see it. And we were often unable to find artifacts for donors or others who were coming to see them. And that felt really awful, especially as a new staff member. That felt really awful. It just felt very unprofessional. And so I wanted to make sure that we remedied that. We also had difficulty selecting pieces for exhibits or even articles because we didn't know which pieces had provenance and which ones didn't. And of course, when I started, the museum was because it was fairly new and had been started fairly professionally. A lot of things were organized pretty well, but there were still issues with overcrowding and lots of piles and the Danes. I included this photograph. One of the key vaults, probably the most visually significant vault that MODA has, is called visual storage. It's actually it's a room with glass on 3 sides, and so you can actually look into the storage room. And so there are open shelving with objects out, so not on formal display, but still visible to the public, which was an awesome way to be able to share more of the collection. But the Danes are known for their porcelains and glassware, and so we had lots and lots of porcelains as well. So kind of just running through quickly, and then I'll get into detail, developing the plan and just how in the world we were going to accomplish this inventory. We had to decide which room was the most significant or where is need. Ultimately, we decided to go with visual storage, which this is another image of the other corner. This was the room that had the most collections and the most significant pieces were in this room. So we figured that would be the most obvious because, again, we had another vault behind this room with a lot of frame storage and large object storage, but those pieces were not easily accessible. These were in a room that the public saw, and so we wanted to both tidy up the space for what visitors would see, but also make sure that any duplication would be remedied and taken care of, just to make that space as presentable and most documented as possible. We had to come up with basic processes, understanding that we were going to have to kind of adjust that process as we came across objects that either needed further stabilization or ones whose numbers maybe didn't match and needed a little more research. There are always those kind of hiccups in any well-planned project. Obviously, we needed staffing. I was the only full-time staff member, so I knew that I was going to need help to make this project complete before retirement age. We knew that we would need some materials to facilitate the project. And then, of course, we weren't entirely sure how much time this was going to take. We knew quite a bit, but I was also in charge of the entire department. So obviously inventory was not the only task that I had. I was also working with donors for new donations. We did have a backlog of 7 years worth of new donations that I had to tackle. I started a collections committee as one of the first major things. I also started our American intern program. So there was a lot on my plate, but I knew that inventory was a major project that I wanted to tackle, and it was important to the institution to know what we had and where it was. So with that, as has been said previously already in the session, there are different types of inventory projects, and I initially took a look at the level of information we had already, both on paper and in the database, and kind of determined from that we wanted to do a complete deep dive inventory. So we recorded, essentially what that meant for us was recording all the basic inventory information that's already been mentioned: object name, object number, home locations. We recorded descriptions and measurements, any maker's marks, materials that something was made of, all of that information. We also did condition reports, and we also did photographs of all of the objects. Once we had all of that information, we also checked paper records for any known provenance. And we then updated database entries. Sometimes that meant creating brand new records for objects that didn't have any database entry yet. Sometimes it was just simply updating those records, which those were our favorites because it didn't take very long on those. But so it was a lot of steps, even from the beginning. But we essentially knew then that as we completed a unit, everything that could possibly be known and recorded about an object on that unit was done. It was all complete. And then we were able to move to the next unit and so on. And then as we changed vaults, we were able to do that, thoroughly for each vault. So it was a very, I also wouldn't necessarily recommend this version of an inventory, but at the same time, I don't think I would have changed our process, because it ended up being a really complete project, and the end product was super helpful. So one of the things that I didn't start initially, but incorporated about 6 months into the project, was deaccessioning considerations. We were noticing as we were going along that a lot of these pieces either didn't have provenance or were heavily redundant. And so we did start incorporating deaccessioning considerations into the project as well. And so we did navigate deaccessioning alongside the inventory project. So it was kind of a twofold project for the duration. And we also did identify some founding collections, not to spend a lot of time on that, but just to touch on, typically when we would identify something that was completely unnumbered or unknown, we would pull that and relocate it. I had a separate inventory list for those objects. We did not put those in the database because I didn't want to confuse anything and potentially assign a new number to something that actually did have an ID number. So those we set aside in a separate storage area to go back to. And shortly before I concluded my time at MODA in 2021, we were just starting that process of actually going through our founding collections, and we were actually thankfully successful with some of those as we were beginning to actually line up objects with old numbers. So that was great. And I also tagged shelves. Somebody else mentioned kind of marking your progress. We tagged each shelf as we were done. As we finished one, we put a tag that said inventory complete, the date, and then our initials on those tags, so that whoever would come in the next day or next shift or whatever would know where to pick up the work. I knew, as I mentioned, that I needed help. We were blessed to have several volunteers that actually predated me. They were long established volunteers that had been helping with all sorts of museum projects, necessarily all collections related, but some of them were very willing to participate for at least those first few years. They did over time kind of age out and decided to sort of retire themselves from the project. And we were grateful then to have lots of interns that we were able to get. They went through pretty intensive training, and I also developed a procedures manual so that, because others have talked about consistency, that's one of the really critical parts about an inventory, of course, is making sure that all this effort and time that you're taking to do this project, you want it to be as consistent and complete and accurate as possible. And so consistency in your process helps you accomplish that. So we had lots of interns over the years, both Danish and American. We were able to use both. And then we, at one point, had a contract employee to work with a very specific part of the collection. And then she actually became full-time staff. We ended up hiring her, and she is actually still full-time staff at MODA. So we were able to hire interns and the contract employee through partially through general budgeting. I was able to just work that into our annual budget a little bit. But as the project developed, and I think our administration plus our board were able to see the success of the project and how much was coming out of, how much knowledge about our own collection was coming out of this inventory. They were very willing to continue funding that through just general budgeting. But I was also successful in getting some grants to help pay for intern time, but also material costs. Through the project, deaccessioning again was one of the processes. The 12,000 objects that we deaccessioned, that sounds like a ton, and it was, but one of the major sections of the inventory was our book collection. So we had, at one point, the museum had developed kind of in the beginning, and then we had a department kind of grow out of the main museum structure called our genealogy center, and that in the end became our archive and library. But in the meantime, there were deposits being made into both the permanent museum collection and the genealogy archive library collection. So at a certain point, we realized we have two independent archive and library collections here that we need to merge. And so the books that we deaccessioned were out of the permanent collection, and some went to other libraries, some went to our own library, but they had to be deaccessioned out of our permanent collection. So that's how that number is so high. But it was still about a third of those numbers. So still about 3,000-4,000 pieces were actually deaccessioned from our object collection, which was pretty significant. We did the usual transfers to other museums and places. Some of our textiles went to a local theater group who used vintage clothing. The pieces that had no history whatsoever, we felt like that was a pretty good reuse for some of those objects. We built our own education collection, which we did not have previously through some of these deaccessions. We did, destroy and toss some of the things that were just in really poor condition that had no other home. And then for those other stragglers that just didn't have homes but were still in really good shape, we did sell some of those and put those funds obviously back into a fund to purchase other collections or for direct care. So kind of to finish out here, it took us 11 years to complete the object and photograph collections, and then most of the book collection, not including the formal genealogy collection, but so that it took us a long time. Again, we did the really deep dive intensive version, so that lengthens it quite a bit. Plus I had other responsibilities to take care of, but 11 years we were pretty happy with. We worked with a lot of interns and volunteers, and ultimately what it gave us was a really strong inventory control. We knew what we had both to use for exhibits and articles. When donors would call to say, hey, we want to see grandma's whatever, I was able to find that object and actually make appointments with them to come in and view those pieces. And that felt tremendously better. It felt like a really nice full circle moment from going from not having any clue what we had or where it was to being able to say, give me 10 minutes and I can find it. And further registrars are now able to just go back and use those existing inventory lists. They can just print those, go in and double check, and it won't take them nearly the length of time to do further inventories as it did us. So I think that's a huge benefit for the museum. Obviously, there's more space for mission-centered collections. So with the deaccessioning that we did, those removed things that were not mission-centered or were heavily duplicates, things that were not in great condition or that we just physically could not care for. So it makes more space for things that really do pertain to the mission and further that collection. As someone else mentioned, we were made aware of certain condition issues by actually touching all of these objects. And so we were able to develop a conservation list so that if we could develop in the future a fund specifically for conservation work, we had those priority items identified. So that was awesome. And we also became very aware then of what are we missing in our collection? What do we have a lot of? What can we say no to? And what do we have a lot of? Or what do we actually need to work on actively building? And it just kind of as an extra aside, it also gave the board and the staff and the public kind of a better view of what a museum does, how we care for our collection, and so that not only broadened support within, internally, but also externally from our members and other constituents. So we were able to use this information pretty regularly to sort of drum up just regular donations that were specifically toward collections care and management. So that was a really great benefit as well. And I'm a good registrar, so I like before and after photos. So just a couple of these before I sign off. I had mentioned lots of boxes and lots of piles. And so these were some of the before photos in our extremely cramped two vault spaces. And these are two of the vaults in our new facility. So tremendous difference, everything, lots of mobile shelving, some open shelving, but tremendous difference. Our framed collections, a lot of them on the left photo at the very left edge, you can see handles. Those were actually some hanging racks that were extremely full, but then just lots of boxes with framed objects just stuffed in them, and you had to move multiple boxes to get to any other box. This was both dangerous for the objects themselves, but also just impossible for collections access. And so we moved to slotted storage instead, which was fantastic. We also used this project as an opportunity to reback our frames. So we removed all the old cardboard and wood backings and replaced them with blueboard. And then finally, our collections office, kind of our workroom intern space. The upper left is what I walked into. This was part of the 7-year backlog of donations that I actually did not know about when I first took the job. But that I inherited, and then kind of a transition middle ground sort of before we got the new building, but we're able to make some progress. And then finally our mobile shelving. So again, just sort of that massive transition, but all resulting from the inventory project. So as Erica read, I've done inventory most of my career. My brain is wired for inventory. So I actually enjoy making sense out of chaos and making order out of all of that. So I am well suited for that kind of project. But yeah, so that is our case study.
Wonderful. Thank you, Angela. And also to Sheer and Sally and Darlene. Erica has head this way. So I'm going to be sort of wrapping up with a few questions and a bit more of our end information. I know some folks have had already to kind of go. So we are over time. I'll probably be limiting questions to about 7-8 minutes, so we're done by 3:45. But I would encourage you and remind you that we do have the follow-up conversations with colleagues on September 30th. So that's a great chance to get to ask even more questions or get a little bit more detail on some of the sort of harder questions or more detailed questions that you're asking right now. So I hope you'll also be able to join us for that. But I'm going to start with a couple of questions that she's kind of already answered in the chat, but they have to do with Open Refine. And the first question was, would Open Refine look at data on 2 worksheets to be able to compare and merge? And Sheer's answer is that you can do that either with Open Refine or Excel Google Sheets itself, especially if you have unique ideas that can be used to match rows. And if not the case, Open Refine may be useful to filter and identify rows without unique IDs, so you can add those manually. But the unique IDs is what's going to help you in the actual merging process. He has a link for a post on Open Refine. And then the other Open Refine question is, I have a very messy notes column and we'll need to do data cleanup soon. Is Open Refine pretty good for that? There's some delimitators in the field, but it's still fairly loose. And Sheer says that Open Refine is great for data cleanup. And if you have used delimitators inconsistently, Open Refine can at least help you automatically split the cells with consistent delimiters, and then you can do the rest manually. And then he notes that one of the favorite parts is the keeps a log of every single change you made. So it's really easy to go back and trace what's happened to your data. All right. And then there's a question about, has anyone used programs instead of Excel? I think we've all noted mostly Excel or Google Sheets here, but if anybody else in the general attendance has used anything else, I think that's great. And then Darlene answered a question I'm trying to answer, just trying to find some of these questions. Where's the question for Darlene about wondering about abandoned property aspects for items of provenance. And Darlene notes down here that Vermont has a statute, and most states do have a specific statute about how you deal with found in collections items. And so they worked on compiling a list and then advertise those objects according to statute. And once they were able to claim title, they could decide whether to accession or dispose of those objects. And then where will we find the slides? So again, you'll get a follow-up email with, again, the recording, probably once we combine the two recordings together, a link for the conversation with colleagues, and a link to the slide decks as well, I believe. And then a few of Angela's images were in previously unmanaged collections. I think, as was mentioned, Angela Kipp's book, which I believe is now currently on its second edition. And I will say, Angela, that those slides that you shared do, of course, give us all hope in looking at our collections and knowing what is possible.
And that was a long time coming. So I think when I started, I would not have actually envisioned that. It was a lot of work and a lot of patience. So a lot of advocating. We all talk about advocating for ourselves, and that was a direct result of all of that.
Great. Yes. So Sally says images are a dream come true. Agreed. All right. And I think just going through again as I sort of pop through these. So Sheer says that sort of programs instead of Excel, love to try out Airtable for inventorying. So Airtable is another, again, shareable sort of database spreadsheet style program. But as he notes, it does come at a cost. You can do very basic Airtable for free, but not at the level that you. All right. Okay, I think I got most things, but again, if not, please come to the conversation with colleagues. I believe we'll also get contact information. It was shared on screen for most everybody, but if not, we can certainly get that to you for all of our presenters if you have follow-up questions and you can't come to our conversations with colleagues. And just a quick note, we're excited to see everybody at this webinar, and we do about 4 to 5 webinars each year. So our next coming up is actually going to be one on active collections in early December. We'll be getting the date out to everybody soon. But if you're interested in learning active collections and sort of approaches that can help your collections, stay tuned for information on that. And I think that is everything. I'm going to double check with Kelly that there wasn't anything else we need to do before we sign off.
All set. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.